The morning began like any other at the public middle school on the east side of the city, where students came from working families and carried their hopes quietly in their backpacks. And among them was a 12-year-old black boy named Aaron who walked through the front doors holding his books close to his chest as he always did because he had learned early that staying small helped him stay unnoticed. And that was how he survived most days since he was new to the school and still learning which halls were safe and which eyes followed him longer than others. Aaron had transferred only 2 months earlier after his mother found a better job nearby. And he had not told anyone that the move scared him because he was the oldest child and felt responsible for being strong and helpful at home. And at school he spoke softly and kept his head down, and when teachers called on him he answered politely but briefly, and his classmates saw him as quiet and different. And some of them assumed that meant weak, though they were wrong in ways none of them yet understood. Music was the one place where Aaron felt free, though no one at school knew this about him. Because at home, his grandmother had taught him to play the piano on an old upright instrument with chipped keys, and a sound that buzzed in the lower notes. And she had taught him not from books but from listening and feeling and remembering melodies from church and from old records, and from her own hands moving slowly over the keys. And Aaron practiced every evening after homework while his siblings slept and his mother worked late shifts, and the piano became his secret refuge. At school, the principal was a man named Richard Hale who had been there for over 15 years, and believed he understood teenagers better than they understood themselves. And he often used public demonstrations and jokes to make points about discipline and humility. And though he claimed his methods were harmless, many students felt nervous when they were called into assemblies where he liked to surprise people for the sake of laughter and control. And that particular week, the school was buzzing because the annual talent show was approaching and auditions were about to begin. During a staff meeting, Principal Hale mentioned that the talent show needed more excitement and that students lacked confidence and initiative. And he joked that some of them would not perform even if pushed on stage, and a few teachers laughed while others looked away. And someone suggested spontaneous participation to encourage courage. And that idea stayed with him because he enjoyed the power of unpredictability and the attention it brought him. Later that day during lunch duty, he noticed Aaron sitting alone at a table near the wall, eating quietly and reading a worn paperback book. And something about the boy caught his eye, not curiosity but opportunity, because Aaron looked nervous and withdrawn, and the principal thought that calling him out in front of everyone might make a good example. And he remembered that the auditorium piano had been tuned recently, and the thought amused him, and he smiled to himself, believing the moment would be harmless fun. The next morning, the entire 7th grade was called into the auditorium under the excuse of an important announcement, and students filled the seats talking loudly until the lights dimmed, and the stage curtain lifted slightly, revealing the grand piano at center stage, which surprised many because instruments were rarely brought out unless there was a performance, and whispers moved through the rows as the principal stepped up to the microphone with a wide smile. He spoke about courage and stepping outside comfort zones, and how fear should never stop someone from trying. And then he said he wanted to make the message real and asked teachers to bring Aaron from his seat near the back. And Aaron felt his stomach drop as he stood because he had no idea why he was being singled out. And laughter rippled through the crowd as some students nudged each other, already sensing entertainment. When Aaron reached the stage, the principal placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke kindly but loudly, asking if he had ever played the piano. And Aaron shook his head instinctively because he was afraid of being exposed, and the principal chuckled and said that was perfect, and told the audience they were about to witness a lesson in bravery, and that Aaron would play something for them right then and there. And the laughter grew louder because everyone assumed the boy would fail. Aaron felt heat rush to his face, and his hands trembled as he looked at the piano, which suddenly did not feel like a friend, but like a spotlight of judgment. And he wanted to explain that he did know how to play, but fear kept his mouth closed, because he had learned that honesty sometimes made things worse. And the principal guided him to the bench, and motioned for the crowd to quiet down, though his smile suggested he expected amusement. In the front row sat the music teacher, Ms. Delgado, who had been organizing the talent show. And as she watched the scene unfold, a knot formed in her chest, because she sensed that something was wrong, and she recognized the look on Aaron's face as fear, not laziness or defiance. And she stood slightly from her seat as if to intervene, but hesitated because challenging the principal publicly could cost her position. And so she waited, hoping the moment would pass quickly. Aaron sat at the bench staring at the keys, and the auditorium was filled with murmurs and suppressed laughter. And he could hear someone whisper that the principal was about to embarrass the new kid, and another voice agreed. And the weight of those words pressed down on him, because he knew that once laughter turned cruel, it could follow a person for years. And he closed his eyes for a brief second, thinking of his grandmother's hands, and her voice telling him to breathe and trust the music. The principal leaned toward the microphone again and said that it was fine if Aaron could not play, because the point was to try, and that failure was nothing to be ashamed of. And though his words sounded supportive, his tone carried a hint of mockery that many students recognized, and the audience grew quiet, waiting for the inevitable mistake. And Aaron placed his fingers on the keys, gently feeling their familiar texture, and something inside him shifted. He did not plan to play at first because fear still sat heavy in his chest. But as his fingers rested, their muscle memory took over, and the first chord emerged soft but clear, and a few students laughed, thinking it was random noise. But then a melody followed steady and warm, and the laughter faded into confusion, and Aaron opened his eyes and focused on the keyboard, letting the room disappear as he played a piece his grandmother loved, one that told a story without words. The sound filled the auditorium, growing stronger and more confident with each measure, and students leaned forward in their seats and whispers turned into silence. And even the principal stepped back from the microphone, surprised, because this was not the outcome he expected. And the music teacher felt tears sting her eyes as she recognized the skill and emotion in the performance, and realized that something important was happening. Aaron played with a depth that came from years of quiet practice, and from emotions he rarely expressed aloud, and his hands moved gracefully across the keys, and the piano responded with a richness that transformed the space. And when he reached the final chord, he let it linger gently before lifting his hands, and the silence that followed was heavy and complete, as if the entire school was holding its breath. For a moment no one spoke, and then applause erupted, starting from the front rows and spreading quickly, until the entire auditorium was filled with clapping and cheers. And some students stood without realizing it, and the principal's face shifted from amusement to shock, because the prank he had planned had turned into something else, something that exposed not the boy but himself, and he forced a smile and returned to the microphone, trying to regain control of the moment. Aaron stood slowly, feeling dizzy and unsure of what to do next, because he had not expected applause, and he searched the crowd for a familiar face and saw Ms. Delgado nodding at him with pride and encouragement. And in that moment he felt something he had not felt since, transferring a sense of belonging and recognition. And though he did not yet know it, this performance was only the beginning of a chain of events that would challenge the school in ways none of them anticipated. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. The applause did not stop quickly, and it rolled through the auditorium like a wave that surprised everyone, including Aaron, who stood frozen near the piano with his hands at his sides, and his heart racing, because he had never been clapped for like that before, and the sound felt unreal, almost too loud and too sudden, and he wondered if it would disappear just as quickly as it came. Students who had laughed minutes earlier now looked at him differently, and some stared with open mouths, while others whispered his name, trying to understand how the quiet boy they barely noticed had just filled the room with something so powerful. And a few teachers exchanged looks, because they knew they had just witnessed a moment that could not be undone or ignored, and the principal cleared his throat as if the noise itself challenged his authority. Principal Hale raised his hands, signaling for silence, and though the clapping slowly faded, the energy in the room stayed charged, and he forced a laugh, saying he had not expected that at all, and that clearly Aaron had been hiding a talent. And the words sounded light, but inside he felt exposed, because the prank had slipped out of his control and turned into a spotlight on his own poor judgment. Aaron was told to return to his seat, and as he walked down the steps, students shifted to make room for him, and some reached out to tap his shoulder or whisper good job, and others simply watched quietly, unsure of how to react to the change in social gravity that had just occurred. And Aaron kept his eyes forward, because he did not know how to handle attention and feared it might turn back into mockery at any moment. When the assembly ended, students poured into the hallways, buzzing with talk, and Aaron's name echoed in conversations, and phones came out with messages already being sent to friends who were not there. And by the time the lunch bell rang, almost everyone in the 7th grade knew what had happened, and rumors grew with every retelling, some saying he was a prodigy, others claiming he had been trained professionally, and none of it felt real to him as he sat at his desk trying to focus on math problems. Ms. Delgado found him after class and gently asked if he would come to the music room, and her voice carried warmth and respect that immediately put him at ease. And when they were alone, she told him how proud she was and asked where he had learned to play, and he hesitated before telling her about his grandmother and the old piano at home, and the evenings spent practicing quietly. And she listened closely, realizing that this boy's talent had been nurtured not for attention, but for survival and comfort. She asked if he had ever performed before, and he shook his head, saying it had always been just for family and church, and she nodded understanding, and then carefully brought up the talent show, suggesting he consider auditioning. And Aaron felt fear return, because the idea of choosing the spotlight felt different from being pushed into it. And he said he was not sure, and she did not push him, instead telling him that the choice would always be his, and that his music deserved to be heard when he was ready. Meanwhile, the principal sat in his office, replaying the scene in his mind, and feeling a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness. And though some part of him knew he had crossed a line, he told himself that the outcome had been positive, and that the boy had benefited from the exposure, and this rationalization helped him avoid responsibility. But it did not erase the uncomfortable feeling that lingered, especially when a few teachers quietly questioned his approach later that day. At home that evening, Aaron's mother noticed something different in him, the way he moved with more energy, and the way he smiled when his younger sister asked about school. And when he finally told her what had happened, she covered her mouth in shock and pride, and listened carefully as he described the moment on stage and the applause and the confusion. And she hugged him tightly, saying she wished his grandmother could have seen it. And that night the piano at home sounded brighter than usual as Aaron played with a new sense of purpose. The next day school felt different, and not entirely in a good way, because attention brought pressure. And a few students who felt threatened by his sudden recognition made comments questioning whether the moment had been staged or accusing him of showing off, and others tried to befriend him, suddenly asking about lessons and competitions. And Aaron did not know who to trust, so he retreated into silence again, unsure how to navigate the shifting social ground. One student named Marcus, who had often been loud and confident, felt especially bothered, because he was known as the school performer and had planned to dominate the talent show. And now he felt overshadowed, and during gym class he made a sarcastic remark about pianists being soft and not real performers, and some laughed nervously. And Aaron felt the sting, but said nothing, choosing instead to focus on getting through the day without conflict. Ms. Delgado noticed the tension and began paying closer attention, making sure Aaron was not isolated or targeted. And she spoke privately with a counselor about the assembly and the prank aspect, and whether it had crossed ethical boundaries. And the counselor agreed that singling out a student like that could have caused harm, and they began documenting the incident quietly, not to create drama, but to ensure accountability if needed. As the week went on, the principal announced that Aaron would be invited to perform at the talent show as a special guest, and this announcement was made without consulting him or his family. And when Aaron heard about it, his stomach tightened because he felt his autonomy slipping away again, and Ms. Delgado immediately stepped in, requesting a meeting with the principal to discuss consent and student well-being, and the conversation that followed was tense, because for the first time someone challenged his narrative. Directly, she explained that what happened had been risky, and that while the outcome had been positive, it could have easily been damaging, and that forcing another performance without permission repeated the same mistake. And the principal listened stiffly and said he would think about it, but his pride made it difficult to admit fault, and the meeting ended without resolution, though a seed of doubt had been planted. Aaron's parents were soon contacted by Ms. Delgado, who wanted them to be aware of the situation. And when they came in for a meeting, they spoke calmly but firmly about their son's right to feel safe and respected. And Aaron's mother shared how music was personal and healing for him, not a tool for entertainment. And this conversation carried weight because it came from lived experience and not theory, and the principal could not dismiss it as easily. Word of the meeting spread quietly among staff, and students sensed that something serious was unfolding beneath the surface, and the school atmosphere shifted from excitement to reflection. And some students began questioning the assembly and whether it had been fair, and for the first time discussions about respect and power moved beyond textbooks into lived reality. Aaron continued attending classes, navigating whispers and stares, but also moments of genuine kindness and support. And though he still felt unsure, he began to understand that his music had opened a door not just for himself, but for conversations the school had avoided. And as he sat at the piano during free period playing softly for himself, he did not know what the future held, but he knew that something had changed and it could not be taken back. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. The following week began with a strange mix of tension and curiosity that settled over the school like a low cloud. And Aaron felt it the moment he stepped through the front doors, because conversations stopped when he passed, and eyes followed him in ways that made his shoulders tighten and his steps slow, and even teachers seemed more alert, as if they were watching not just the students but the space between them. Aaron tried to keep his routine the same because routine felt safe and predictable, and he arrived early each morning to sit quietly in homeroom and review notes, but even their whispers floated across the room. And though no one directly mocked him, the silence carried weight and expectation, and he wondered if people were waiting for him to prove something again or to fail so that balance could return. In English class, the teacher assigned a group project, and Aaron was placed with two students he barely knew. And one of them, a girl named Lena, surprised him by speaking kindly and asking about the piano, and not in the excited tone others used, but with genuine interest. And she shared that her brother played violin and that music helped him cope with anxiety, and that small moment of connection eased something in Aaron's chest, because it reminded him that not all attention was dangerous. During lunch, Marcus and his friends sat across the room watching Aaron, and though they said nothing loud enough to be reported, their body language carried challenge and resentment. And Marcus leaned back, laughing too hard at jokes that were not funny, and Aaron sensed that the attention had shifted from curiosity to competition. And that made him uneasy, because he had never wanted to compete with anyone. Ms. Delgado continued to check in quietly, and she encouraged Aaron to use the music room during free periods where he could play without pressure. And there the piano became once again a place of grounding. And while he played, she sat nearby grading papers and listening, not as an audience but as a witness. And sometimes she asked questions about his grandmother and the music she taught him, and those conversations helped Aaron feel seen as a person, not a performance. Behind closed doors, discussions among staff grew more serious, because the counselor had completed a report outlining the emotional risks of the assembly prank, and several teachers added observations about the school culture and how students of color were often put on the spot in ways others were not. And these conversations were uncomfortable but necessary. And though no official action had been taken, yet the principal felt the pressure building. Principal Hale responded by becoming more controlled in public and more defensive in private, and he insisted that his intentions had been good and that the outcome justified the method, and he reminded staff of his years of service and experience. But the usual authority of those words felt weaker now, because the situation had sparked awareness, and people were asking questions they had avoided for years. At home, Aaron's parents noticed the change in him again, this time a quiet seriousness mixed with thoughtfulness, and they encouraged him to talk openly about what he was feeling. And one evening after dinner, he admitted that he was scared of being pushed to perform again and scared of being judged if he did not, and his father listened carefully and told him that his worth did not depend on talent or applause, and that he had the right to choose when and how he shared his gifts. That night, Aaron dreamed of the auditorium again, but this time the seats were empty and the piano was silent. And when he woke, he realized that the fear was not just about embarrassment, but about losing control over something sacred to him. And that realization stayed with him through the next day as he walked into school with new clarity and quiet resolve. The talent show auditions began midweek and students lined up outside the music room laughing and practicing. And the atmosphere buzzed with excitement and competition, and Aaron watched from a distance because he had not signed up. And though several students urged him to join, he politely declined, saying he was not ready. And some accepted that, while others looked confused, as if they could not understand why someone would step away from attention after tasting it. Marcus auditioned with a high-energy performance and received loud praise from his friends. And when he came out of the room, he glanced at Aaron with a tight smile that held more challenge than friendliness. And later, during science class, he made a comment about how real performers showed up when it mattered. And the teacher quickly redirected the conversation. But the message landed, and Aaron felt the familiar urge to disappear. Ms. Delgado later addressed the class, indirectly speaking about respect and choice, and how talent did not create obligation. And her words were calm but firm, and some students shifted uncomfortably because they recognized themselves in the message. And though no names were mentioned, the room grew quiet and reflective. As the days passed, the school counselor requested a formal review of assembly practices, and the district was notified, which added another layer of seriousness. And Principal Hale was asked to submit a statement explaining the intent and outcome of the incident, and writing it forced him to confront details he had avoided, including the laughter at Aaron's expense before the music began, and the assumptions he had made based on the boy's silence and demeanor. Students also began to talk among themselves more openly, and some admitted that they had laughed because they thought that was what was expected, and others said they felt uncomfortable, but did not know how to speak up. And these conversations happened in hallways and online. And slowly, the narrative shifted from celebrating a surprising performance to questioning why it had been framed as a prank in the first place. Aaron became aware of these discussions through bits and pieces, and while part of him felt relieved that people were thinking more deeply, another part felt overwhelmed, because he never wanted to be the center of a moral lesson, and he struggled with guilt, wondering if speaking up earlier could have prevented some of the tension, though adults assured him that responsibility did not rest on his shoulders. One afternoon, Ms. Delgado invited Aaron and his parents to the music room after school, and she shared that the district might recommend a restorative assembly where students could discuss respect and consent. And she asked Aaron if he would feel comfortable participating in a conversation, not a performance. And she emphasized that the choice was entirely his, and that his voice mattered regardless of what he decided. Aaron took time to think, and that evening he sat at the piano playing softly and reflecting on how music had given him courage in unexpected ways. And he realized that while he did not want to be pushed into the spotlight, he did want his experience to mean something so that others would not feel the same fear and isolation. And with that understanding, he told his parents that he was willing to speak if he could do it honestly and on his own terms. The decision brought a new kind of nervousness, but also a sense of purpose. And when he returned to school the next day, he felt steadier, as if he had reclaimed a piece of control, and Ms. Delgado smiled when he told her, and assured him that she would support him throughout the process, and that he would never be alone on that stage again. As plans began to form, the school atmosphere shifted once more from tension to cautious hope, and though challenges remained, and not everyone was ready to reflect honestly, the seed of change had been planted, and Aaron, standing quietly at the center of it, all began to understand that his story was not just about music or talent, but about dignity, choice, and the power of being heard on one's own terms. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content. Without them, the announcement of a restorative assembly spread slowly through the school, and it did not come with excitement or applause, but with curiosity and uncertainty, because students were used to assemblies telling them what to do, not asking them how they felt. And this one promised conversation instead of performance, which made many uneasy, including Aaron, who felt the weight of attention returning in a different form. Preparation began quietly and carefully, and the counselor met with Aaron several times to help him shape what he wanted to say, and more importantly, to remind him that silence was also a valid choice, and that he was not responsible for fixing the school. And these meetings took place in a small office with soft lighting and chairs arranged in a circle, and there Aaron spoke about fear and music, and how it felt to be laughed at before being heard, and each time he spoke, the words came easier and steadier. Ms. Delgado also played a role, not as a director, but as a steady presence, and she helped Aaron understand that honesty did not require drama, and that simple truth spoken calmly could be powerful, and together they practiced what he might say if he chose to speak. And she reminded him that his story belonged to him and not to the school or the principal or the audience. Meanwhile, Principal Hale was facing his own reckoning, though he did not frame it that way to himself. And he attended meetings with district officials, who asked difficult questions about consent and power and student dignity. And though no formal punishment had been decided, the tone of the conversations made it clear that his leadership style was under scrutiny. And this unsettled him, because he had always believed that authority came from confidence and decisiveness, not reflection. In classrooms, teachers began preparing students for the assembly by talking about respect and empathy, and how humor could cross into harm. And these conversations were uneven because some teachers felt confident guiding them, while others struggled with discomfort and avoided depth. But even the shallow discussions signaled that something different was happening, and students noticed that adults were not pretending everything was normal. Marcus reacted strongly to the shift, and he voiced frustration to friends, saying the whole thing was being blown out of proportion, and that no one had meant harm and that people were too sensitive. And his words reflected a fear of losing status and attention, and though some agreed, others were quieter and less convinced. And the social dynamics around him began to change in subtle ways. Aaron sensed this tension, and he tried to stay out of it, focusing on his work and spending time in the music room where the piano waited patiently. And there he played pieces that carried both sadness and hope. And he noticed that his playing had changed, becoming more expressive, as if it now carried not just private emotion but shared experience. And this realization both comforted and scared him. At home, conversations continued, and his parents supported his decision to speak, but reminded him that he did not owe anyone vulnerability, and that protecting his emotional well-being came first. And his mother shared stories of her own school experiences where silence had been the only option, and she expressed pride that he had choices she never did, and that knowledge strengthened Aaron's resolve. The day of the assembly arrived quietly, without banners or excitement, and students filed into the auditorium with mixed expressions. And the piano remained on stage, but covered and centered off to the side, signaling that this would not be another performance. And Aaron sat near the front with Ms. Delgado and the counselor nearby, and his heart beat fast but steady because he had prepared not to impress but to be honest. The principal opened the assembly with a brief statement, acknowledging that the school had made mistakes and that they were there to listen and learn. And though his words were measured and careful, some students sensed the effort behind them, and the room stayed quiet, not out of fear but anticipation. And the counselor then explained the purpose of the gathering, emphasizing respect and shared responsibility. When Aaron was invited to speak, he stood slowly and walked to the microphone, and the room felt vast and silent, and he took a breath, remembering his grandmother's voice. And he spoke clearly about how it felt to be called out unexpectedly and laughed at, and how music had always been a safe place for him, and how that safety had been threatened in that moment. And he did not accuse or dramatize, but simply described his experience, and the honesty in his voice carried weight. He spoke about choice and how being brave did not mean being forced, and how talent did not erase fear. And as he spoke, students listened, many for the first time, hearing a peer articulate emotions they recognized but had never named. And when he finished, there was silence again, but it was thoughtful and heavy and respectful. Others were invited to share, and a few students spoke about feeling pressured to perform or conform. And a teacher admitted that she had laughed out of discomfort and regret. And these admissions were not easy, but they created space for understanding, and the assembly became a mirror reflecting the school culture back to itself without shouting or blame. The principal listened from the side, and though he maintained composure, the words affected him. And for the first time, he saw the incident not as a misjudged joke, but as a moment that revealed deeper issues, and this realization unsettled him because it challenged his self-image. But it also opened a door to change if he chose to walk through it. After the assembly, students returned to class quieter than usual, and conversations were softer and more reflective. And some students approached Aaron thanking him for speaking, and others simply nodded with new respect. And though the attention returned, it felt different, less demanding and more human, and Aaron felt lighter knowing he had spoken his truth without being pushed. In the days that followed, small changes appeared. Teachers asked for consent. More explicitly, students questioned jokes that crossed lines. And the school began discussing new guidelines for assemblies and public activities. And though these changes were gradual and imperfect, they signaled a shift in awareness and accountability. Marcus struggled with the new environment, and he felt unsure of his place, and during one class discussion, he remained silent, listening to others speak. And for the first time, he questioned whether confidence without empathy was strength or just noise. And this internal conflict marked the beginning of his own growth, though he did not yet recognize it. Aaron returned to the music room after school and played quietly, and Ms. Delgado listened from a distance. And she noticed a calm confidence in his posture and playing. And she realized that while the school had learned from him, he had also learned from the experience that his voice mattered beyond the piano, and that realization would shape the choices he made going forward. The talent show approached, and plans changed, and participation became voluntary and consent-focused, and Aaron chose not to perform. And this choice was respected and celebrated as valid and powerful. And for the first time he felt that saying no did not make him invisible but affirmed his agency. As the semester continued, the incident faded from daily conversation, but its impact remained woven into the fabric of the school. And Aaron moved through the halls with quiet confidence, and though challenges remained, he no longer felt alone or small. And he understood that dignity was not given by applause but claimed through honesty and choice. And this understanding marked a turning point not just for him but for everyone who listened. If any dots or ellipses appear, rewrite the content without them. The weeks after the restorative assembly passed with a slower and more thoughtful rhythm. And the school settled into a new normal that felt unfamiliar but meaningful, and Aaron noticed it in small moments like teachers asking before calling on students and classmates pausing before making jokes. And these shifts did not erase past mistakes, but they changed how people moved forward together. Aaron continued focusing on his studies, and his grades improved slightly, not because he worked harder than before, but because his mind felt clearer and less burdened by fear. And he began raising his hand occasionally in class and speaking when he had something to say. And though his voice was still soft, it carried confidence, and teachers listened more attentively, now aware that quiet did not mean empty. Ms. Delgado encouraged Aaron to explore music theory and composition, and she offered him optional lessons after school which he accepted cautiously. And these sessions became a space for growth and exploration rather than pressure, and Aaron learned how to name chords and structure melodies. And he enjoyed understanding the language behind what he had always felt instinctively, and this knowledge deepened his connection to music. At home, his family noticed the change as well, and his siblings listened more closely when he played, and his mother asked questions about his day, and his father shared stories from his own childhood about learning to stand up without losing kindness. And these conversations strengthened their bond and helped Aaron feel supported not just as a talented child, but as a whole person navigating complexity. The principal presence in the school shifted noticeably, and he became more reserved and less performative in assemblies and announcements. And while some students still felt cautious around him, others noticed efforts to listen and adapt, and though trust was not instantly restored, the change suggested that reflection had taken root, and that accountability was possible even for those in power. Marcus struggled quietly with his changing role, and he found that attention no longer came as easily, and that his loud confidence did not carry the same influence it once had. And during one group project he was paired with Aaron unexpectedly, and the initial tension was thick but unavoidable, and they worked through it, slowly exchanging ideas and discovering shared frustrations about expectations and identity. During those sessions, Marcus admitted that he had felt threatened and embarrassed, and that his comments came from insecurity rather than malice, and Aaron listened without judgment, and shared how fear had shaped his silence, and the conversation did not erase the past, but it created understanding and respect. And when the project ended, they were not friends, but they were no longer adversaries. The school implemented new guidelines for student participation and assemblies, emphasizing consent and preparation, and these policies were discussed openly, and students were invited to give feedback, and this inclusion fostered a sense of shared responsibility and ownership. And though not every student engaged deeply, the option to be heard changed the culture in subtle but lasting ways. Aaron began mentoring a younger student who showed interest in piano, and the connection formed naturally when the student wandered into the music room during lunch and watched Aaron play. And Aaron remembered his own first days feeling lost and unseen, and he offered simple guidance and encouragement. And through this mentorship, he discovered that teaching brought a different kind of fulfillment, one rooted in patience and empathy. The talent show took place with a new tone, and it was smaller and less flashy but more sincere, and students performed because they wanted to, not because they were pushed. And the audience listened with respect, and applause felt earned and shared, and Aaron attended as a spectator and felt content watching others shine without feeling the need to step forward himself. As the semester neared its end, the counselor conducted follow-up sessions with students and staff, gathering reflections and feedback, and the responses revealed growth but also ongoing challenges. And the school acknowledged that change was a process, not a single event, and this honesty reinforced the lessons learned and set expectations for continued effort. Aaron received recognition not for his performance but for his leadership and courage in speaking up, and the acknowledgement came in a quiet letter rather than a public announcement. And he appreciated the privacy and intention behind it, and he kept the letter folded in his backpack as a reminder that impact did not always need a stage. Music remained central to his life, but it no longer felt like a secret refuge alone, and it became a bridge connecting him to others on his terms. And he composed a short piece inspired by the experience, and shared it with Ms. Delgado, who listened with pride, and told him that his voice was evolving both musically and personally. As the school year ended, Aaron reflected on how much had changed since that first assembly, and he understood that growth often came through discomfort, and that being seen did not always require performance but presence and honesty. And he stepped into summer carrying these lessons with him, ready for whatever came next, knowing that his story was still unfolding, and that he now had the strength to shape it himself. Summer arrived quietly and gave Aaron space to breathe. and for the first time in a long while his days were not shaped by bells or hallways or watchful eyes, and instead they were shaped by light through the window and the familiar sound of the piano in his living room and long conversations with his family that stretched into the evening without urgency. Aaron spent hours practicing not because he felt pressure to improve, but because music felt like a place where he could think clearly and sort through everything that had happened. And sometimes he played the same piece again and again, exploring how different emotions changed the sound, and other times he experimented with new melodies, letting his hands wander freely. And through this process, he learned to trust his instincts more deeply. His grandmother's old teachings came back to him, often especially her belief that music carried memory and intention, and he began to understand that what he had played on the school stage was not just skill, but years of quiet listening and feeling. And that realization helped him reclaim the moment as something that belonged to him rather than something taken from him. During the summer, Ms. Delgado stayed in touch, sending occasional messages, encouraging him to keep playing and sharing simple resources about composition and music history. And Aaron appreciated the balance because it felt supportive without being demanding, and it reminded him that guidance did not have to come with expectation. Marcus also changed during the summer, though Aaron did not see him often, and when they did cross paths at a community center event, the interaction was brief but respectful, and Marcus nodded and asked how Aaron's summer was going, and the question felt genuine and unforced, and Aaron answered honestly. And in that moment, both of them recognized that growth had taken place quietly and separately. As summer progressed, Aaron began volunteering at a local community center, where children gathered after school. Programs and music sessions were offered once a week. And when the coordinator learned that Aaron played piano, she invited him to help. And at first he hesitated, unsure if he was ready to guide others. But the memory of the younger student he had mentored gave him courage, and he agreed to try. The first session was awkward and unpolished, and the children were loud and impatient and curious all at once. And Aaron felt unsure of how to manage the energy, but instead of trying to control it, he listened and adjusted, and soon the room settled into a rhythm, and the children responded to his calm presence and simple instructions. And when one child played a wrong note and laughed nervously, Aaron smiled and said that mistakes were part of learning and meant you were brave enough to try. That moment stayed with him because he realized he was offering others the safety he had once needed, and this understanding deepened his sense of purpose and showed him that leadership could be gentle and that influence did not require authority or volume. As the new school year approached, Aaron felt a mix of anticipation and concern, and he wondered how the changes from the previous year would hold, and whether the lessons learned would last beyond memory and discussion. And he prepared himself mentally, reminding himself of his right to choose and speak and set boundaries. On the first day back, the school felt both familiar and new, and there were new students, and some teachers had changed, but the atmosphere felt calmer and more intentional. And during the opening assembly, the principal spoke briefly about values and respect, and his tone was steady and restrained, and he did not single anyone out, and the absence of spectacle felt like progress. Aaron noticed that students interacted differently, and while not everyone had changed, the overall mood felt less performative and more aware, and teachers paused more often to check in and ask questions. And though the system was still imperfect, it felt more humane. Ms. Delgado welcomed Aaron back warmly and asked if he would like to continue lessons, and he agreed. And they set goals together focused on growth and enjoyment rather than performance. And these sessions became a space where Aaron explored not just music, but confidence and decision-making and identity. The school counselor also checked in and asked how he was feeling about the new year, and Aaron spoke honestly about his hopes and fears. And the counselor listened and validated his experience, reminding him that progress was ongoing and that setbacks did not erase growth. And this support reinforced Aaron's trust in adults who listened rather than directed. Marcus joined the school choir that year, surprising many, including himself, and he discovered that blending his voice with others required listening and cooperation. And though he struggled at first, he found satisfaction in being part of something larger than himself, and this shift in his path reflected the broader changes happening quietly across the school. Aaron decided to join an after-school music club that focused on collaboration rather than competition, and there, he met students from different backgrounds who shared a love for sound and expression, and together they experimented with combining instruments and styles. And Aaron found joy in shared creation without spotlight or judgment. One afternoon during a rehearsal, a younger student froze and stopped playing, afraid of making a mistake. And Aaron recognized the fear immediately, and he paused the group and shared a simple story about how fear once stopped him too, and how choosing to continue had changed his life, and the honesty in his voice created trust. And the student nodded and tried again, and the music continued stronger than before. The principal observed one of these rehearsals quietly, and afterward, he thanked Aaron for his leadership, and though the words were brief, they carried sincerity. And Aaron accepted them without resentment or pride, recognizing that growth did not erase the past, but acknowledged it and moved forward. As months passed, Aaron's identity expanded beyond the moment that once defined him, and he became known not just as the boy who played piano, but as someone thoughtful, reliable, and kind. And this shift mattered deeply because it meant he was being seen fully rather than symbolically. At home, his family continued to support him and his siblings bragged about his teaching, and his mother attended a community center session and watched him guide children with patience and grace. And she felt pride not just in his talent, but in his character, and she told him that evening that he had grown into someone who could change rooms simply by being present. Aaron internalized this truth slowly and carefully, understanding that his strength came from awareness and choice, and that his voice mattered whether spoken through words or music. And as the year unfolded, he felt more grounded and prepared to face challenges with clarity rather than fear. The school continued its efforts to build a culture of consent and respect, and students participated in discussions and workshops. And while progress was uneven, the commitment remained. And Aaron watched these developments knowing that his experience had played a role, but also understanding that lasting change required collective effort. As spring approached, Aaron composed another piece inspired by growth and resilience, and he shared it with his club, and they played it together, transforming a solo creation into a shared expression. And the sound filled the room with warmth and balance, and in that moment Aaron felt a deep sense of peace. He realized that what had once begun as a painful and unexpected moment had evolved into a journey of self-discovery and community change. And though the path had been difficult, it had revealed strength he did not know he had and connections he had not expected, and he understood that his story was not defined by a prank or a stage, but by the choices he made afterward, and the integrity he carried forward. As the year moved closer to its end, a quiet confidence settled into Aaron's daily life, and it was not the kind that demanded attention or praise, but the kind that allowed him to walk through hallways without shrinking and to sit in classrooms without feeling the need to disappear. And this confidence came from experience, from choice, and from knowing that his voice mattered even when he chose not to use it. The music club grew stronger and more connected, and students began to trust one another enough to experiment and make mistakes, and Aaron naturally became a steady presence in the group, not as a leader by title, but as someone others listened to and respected. And when disagreements came up, he helped guide conversations, calmly reminding everyone that listening mattered as much as playing. And this approach shaped the culture of the group in meaningful ways. Teachers began to notice these changes, and some commented on how Aaron's maturity seemed beyond his age, and how his influence on others was gentle but effective. And these observations were shared quietly among staff, and reinforced the belief that creating space for student agency had real impact beyond policy or rules. One afternoon, the school counselor invited Aaron to participate in a student leadership roundtable that focused on school climate and student well-being. And at first he hesitated because leadership roles still carried memories of pressure and exposure. But after careful thought, he agreed on the condition that participation would be discussion-based rather than performative. And this boundary was respected without question. During the first meeting, students from different grades and backgrounds shared their experiences and challenges, and Aaron listened closely, recognizing familiar themes of fear and expectation and misunderstanding. And when he spoke, he did so thoughtfully, describing how being given choice and support had changed his experience, and how small actions from adults and peers could make a difference. And his words resonated because they came from lived experience rather than theory. The group began working on suggestions for improving student voice and consent in school activities, and Aaron contributed ideas shaped by reflection and empathy, and these ideas were taken seriously, and some were later adopted into school practices. And seeing this process unfold helped Aaron understand that change could be collaborative, and that speaking up did not always mean standing alone. Marcus also joined the round table later in the year, and the dynamic between him and Aaron was different, now grounded in mutual respect rather than tension. And during one discussion, Marcus openly acknowledged that he had once confused attention with worth, and that learning to listen had changed his perspective. And Aaron appreciated the honesty and recognized the courage it took to speak that truth aloud. Outside of school, Aaron continued volunteering at the community center, and his role expanded as younger students looked up to him and parents thanked him for his patience and encouragement. And through this work, he learned how to adapt his communication to different needs, and how to hold space for others without losing himself, and these lessons reinforced his sense of purpose. One evening after a session, a parent approached him and shared how her child had struggled with confidence, and how music sessions had become a place of safety and expression. And hearing this, Aaron felt the weight and value of his influence, and understood that his actions reached further than he could always see, and this realization deepened his commitment to kindness and integrity. At school, preparations began for the end-of-year showcase, which was designed differently from past events, and it focused on collaboration and reflection rather than competition, and participation was optional and guided by student interest and consent, and students were invited to share project stories or performances in whatever form felt right to them. Aaron was invited to participate in planning rather than performing, and he accepted this role, comfortably helping ensure that the event remained inclusive and respectful. And when discussions arose about featuring standout talents, he gently reminded the group that the goal was shared expression, not spotlight, and his perspective helped shape the tone of the event. As the showcase approached, some students asked Aaron if he would play, and he considered it, carefully weighing his comfort and intention. And after reflection, he decided that he would contribute a short collaborative piece with the music club rather than a solo performance. And this choice felt right, because it aligned with his values and honored his journey. Rehearsals focused on connection rather than perfection, and Aaron worked with the group to create a piece that allowed each member to contribute meaningfully. And the music reflected balance and trust and shared effort. And as they practiced, Aaron felt gratitude for the path that had led him there, even with its challenges. The principal attended one rehearsal briefly and observed quietly, and afterward he spoke with the group, thanking them for their dedication and acknowledging how the school had grown, and his words were measured and sincere. And while they did not erase the past, they reflected growth and accountability, and Aaron accepted them calmly, recognizing that change was ongoing and imperfect. As the day of the showcase arrived, the atmosphere felt calm and welcoming, and families gathered in the auditorium, and students moved with purpose rather than nerves. And the piano stood uncovered, but it no longer symbolized pressure or surprise, and instead it represented choice and preparation and shared meaning. When the music club took the stage, Aaron sat among them, not at the center, but as part of the whole, and they played together with focus and warmth. And the sound filled the room, not with shock, but with connection, and the audience listened attentively and applauded with genuine appreciation. And in that moment, Aaron felt content, not because of recognition, but because of alignment between who he was and what he was doing. After the performance, students and families mingled and conversations flowed, and several people thanked Aaron for his role in shaping the event. And he accepted the thanks, humbly redirecting credit to the group. And this response reflected how much he had grown in understanding shared success and collective voice. As the year drew to a close, Aaron reflected on how far he had come from that first unexpected moment on stage. And he recognized that while the experience had begun with fear, it had led to growth, connection, and change. And he understood that his strength lay not in avoiding difficulty, but in responding with honesty and care. He carried these lessons forward, knowing that challenges would continue beyond this school and this year, but also knowing that he had the tools to face them with clarity and courage. And as he looked toward the future, he felt grounded in the knowledge that his voice, whether spoken or played, mattered most when it was chosen freely and shared with purpose. The final weeks of the school year arrived with a sense of quiet completion, and Aaron felt it in the way days moved steadily rather than urgently, and in the way people smiled more easily in the hallways, as if everyone could sense that something meaningful had been lived through together and did not need to be repeated to be remembered. Aaron spent more time reflecting than speaking, and he noticed how his reactions to situations had changed, because moments that once would have filled him with anxiety now felt manageable, and he trusted himself to respond thoughtfully rather than retreat. And this internal shift mattered more to him than any external recognition, because it meant he had grown in ways that could not be taken away. In class discussions, he contributed when he felt moved and listened when others spoke, and teachers noticed that his presence brought balance and calm, and some younger students looked to him for cues on how to behave. And though he never set out to lead, he understood now that leadership often showed itself in consistency and respect rather than authority. The music club continued meeting until the last week, and their final session was informal and reflective, and students shared what the group had meant to them and how it had given them a place to belong. And Aaron listened quietly, taking in their words and realizing that what they had built together would last beyond the school year, even as they moved on to different paths. Ms. Delgado met with Aaron one last time before summer break, and she thanked him for trusting her and for helping shape a more thoughtful environment. And she reminded him that his journey with music and voice was still unfolding, and that he should continue choosing paths that honored his values. And her words stayed with him because they affirmed growth without placing expectation. The principal also requested a brief meeting, and this time the conversation felt different because there was no performance, no agenda, and no audience. And he spoke plainly, acknowledging that the incident had changed how he viewed leadership and responsibility, and he thanked Aaron for the grace he had shown. And though the apology was simple, it carried weight because it was offered without defense, and Aaron accepted it calmly, understanding that accountability did not require anger to be meaningful. At home, preparations for summer brought excitement and ease, and Aaron talked with his family about plans for music and volunteering and rest. And his parents listened with pride as he articulated his goals clearly and confidently. And his siblings teased him gently, but also looked up to him, and the warmth of these moments grounded him deeply. On the last day of school, students gathered for brief goodbyes and exchanged messages and promises to stay in touch. And when Aaron walked through the doors one final time, he felt a sense of closure, not because everything was resolved perfectly, but because he had faced challenge and emerged with clarity and strength. Over the summer, Aaron continued his work at the community center and expanded the music sessions into small group activities where children collaborated and supported one another. And he saw reflections of his younger self in their hesitations and hopes, and he guided them gently, remembering always the importance of consent and encouragement. One afternoon, a child asked him why he cared so much about making sure everyone felt comfortable, and Aaron paused before answering, and then said simply that everyone deserved to feel safe when sharing something they loved, and the truth of that statement felt complete and honest and enough. As months passed, Aaron began thinking about the future not with fear, but with curiosity, and he considered how music might remain part of his life not as a measure of worth, but as a companion and tool for connection. And he understood that whatever path he chose, the lessons he had learned about voice dignity and choice would guide him. Looking back, he could see that what began as an unfair moment had grown into a catalyst for change, not just for him, but for those around him, and he recognized that while he had not chosen the beginning, he had chosen the response, and that choice had shaped everything that followed. Aaron learned that courage was not about being unafraid or impressive, but about staying true to oneself even when circumstances were difficult. And he carried this understanding quietly, knowing that it would serve him in ways he could not yet imagine. The story of that day in the auditorium faded into memory for most people, but for Aaron it remained a point of reference, not as a source of pain, but as a reminder of resilience and growth, and he held it gently without letting it define him. As he sat at the piano one evening playing softly with the windows open and summer air drifting in, he felt a deep sense of peace and gratitude, and he knew that his voice, whether spoken or played, would always belong to him, and that knowledge was the most powerful lesson of all. Most powerful lesson of all.